Ethan Grant stood at the heart of his penthouse, surrounded by the glittering elites of Manhattan. The sprawling space was a testament to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the skyline, furniture that screamed sophistication, and art pieces that cost more than most people earned in a year. Every detail of his life was curated to perfection, a seamless blend of wealth and power. Tonight's gathering was no different, a party filled with laughter, expensive liquor, and conversations dripping with entitlement. Ethan basked in the admiration of his peers. Mark, a venture capitalist, was recounting a story of his latest acquisition, while Ryan, heir to a hotel empire, shared his tales of a lavish vacation. These were Ethan's people, men who thrived on flaunting their superiority. Yet, as the evening dragged on, the stories began to blur together, each more hollow than the last. Ethan felt a familiar itch, the need to outdo, to dominate, to prove that he could always go further. "You've done it all, Ethan," Mark said, leaning against the marble countertop with a smirk. "But have you ever done something truly outrageous? Something no one else here would dare?" Ethan tilted his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. His mind raced through possibilities, dismissing each as too simple, too easy. "Outrageous?" he repeated, his tone teasing. "You'll have to be more specific, Mark. My whole life is outrageous." The group chuckled, but Ryan wasn't satisfied. "No, he's got a point," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "You're always on top, Ethan. But what if you really push the envelope? I'm talking about something that would leave everyone speechless." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Ryan's grin widened, mischievous and calculating. "Marry someone, not just anyone, someone completely beneath you. Someone so far out of your world that it's absurd. Then parade her around. Make her think she's living the dream. Let's see how long you can keep it going before she breaks." The room erupted in laughter, the kind of laughter that came from people who had never faced real consequences. Ethan didn't laugh, not immediately. He was thinking, weighing the idea. It was cruel, yes, but it was also bold. A spectacle, a chance to prove, once again, that he was untouchable. "Let me get this straight," Ethan said, his voice measured. "You want me to find some poor, unsuspecting girl, marry her, and make it public? Just to see if she can survive in my world?" "Exactly," Mark said, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Think of it as a social experiment, a test of your charm and her resilience." Ethan leaned back, the hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "And what's in it for me?" Ryan shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "The satisfaction of proving you can pull it off. And, of course, 50 grand says you won't last 3 months before she figures it out or falls apart." Ethan swirled his drink, considering. The money was meaningless to him, but the challenge was intoxicating. He thrived on risk, on power, on the thrill of manipulating situations to his advantage. This wasn't just a bet. It was an opportunity to remind everyone in the room, and himself, that he was untouchable. "You're on," he said finally, raising his glass. The room erupted in cheers, the bet sealed with laughter and clinking glasses. The next day, Ethan set out to find his target. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Someone who would be easy to manipulate but strong enough to make the game interesting. Someone who didn't belong in his world but could be molded to fit, at least temporarily. It didn't take long for him to find her. The diner was unremarkable, a greasy spoon tucked away on the outskirts of the city. Ethan would never have stepped foot in such a place under normal circumstances, but today, it served a purpose. The smell of frying bacon and coffee lingered in the air as he slid into a booth near the back, surveying the room. That's when he saw her. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this job 1,000 times, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups without missing a beat. Her uniform was plain, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, but there was something about her, a quiet dignity that made her stand out from the chaos around her. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it lit up her entire face. Ethan watched her for a moment, intrigued. She wasn't the type to fawn over a man like him, and that made her perfect. Winning her over would be a challenge, a game worth playing. When she finally approached his table, her expression was polite but guarded. "Good morning," she said, her tone professional. "What can I get you?" Ethan flashed his most charming smile. "Just coffee for now. And maybe your name?" She didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to figure him out. "Coffee it is," she said finally, walking away. Ethan's smile widened. This was going to be fun. Over the next few days, he made it his mission to win her over. He returned to the diner daily, always sitting in her section, always finding ways to start a conversation. Her name, he learned, was Ava Brooks. She was hardworking, sharp, and deeply private. She didn't trust easily, which only made Ethan more determined. Ava, for her part, couldn't quite figure him out. He was charming, yes, but there was something off about him, something that didn't fit with the world she knew. Why would a man like him, with his expensive suits and easy confidence, keep coming back to a place like this? And why was he so interested in her? One evening, as they talked, Ava let her guard down just a little. She told him about her younger brother, Jamal, who was studying on a scholarship but needed her support to stay afloat. She spoke of her dreams, of going back to school, of starting her own business one day. Ethan listened, pretending to care, all the while thinking about how he could use her story to his advantage. He began to court her in earnest, showing up with flowers, offering to help with her brother's tuition, and whisking her away on extravagant dates. Ava was hesitant at first, but Ethan had a way of making her feel seen, even as a small voice in the back of her mind warned her to be cautious. "You're different," she said one evening as they walked along the river. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who would be interested in someone like me." Ethan smiled, his expression carefully crafted to look sincere. "Maybe I'm tired of the kind of people you think I belong with," he said. "Maybe I want something real." Ava looked at him, searching his face for any hint of deceit. She didn't find any, or at least not enough to make her walk away. Against her better judgment, she began to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. For Ethan, the bet was going better than he'd anticipated. Ava was perfect, kind, humble, and completely unaware of his true intentions. The plan was falling into place. All he needed now was the final piece, the proposal. The fluorescent lights in the diner buzzed faintly as Ava Brooks wiped down yet another table. It was late, well past 10 p.m., but the diner was still busy, the hum of conversation and clinking silverware filling the air. Ava's hands moved with practiced efficiency, her mind racing through everything she needed to do once her shift ended. Her younger brother, Jamal, would need to be checked on, his textbooks paid for, and his laundry folded. Another sleepless night awaited her, but Ava was used to that. Sleep had long been a luxury she couldn't afford. Ava had grown up understanding struggle. Born in a small town in Georgia, she was the eldest of 3 siblings and had taken on a motherly role when her parents' marriage began to falter. Her father, once a proud factory worker, turned to alcohol when his job was outsourced overseas. Her mother tried to hold things together, juggling multiple jobs, but the strain eventually tore the family apart. By the time Ava was 15, she was working part-time after school, contributing every penny she earned to keep food on the table. College had always been a dream for Ava, but life had other plans. After high school, she was accepted into a state university, but had to defer when her mother fell ill and could no longer work. Ava stayed home to care for her siblings, taking on multiple jobs to make ends meet. Dreams of a degree and a career became distant as the demands of survival took precedence. When her mother passed away a few years later, Ava became the de facto head of the household, her siblings looking to her for guidance and support. Now, at 27, Ava was still carrying the weight of those responsibilities. Her youngest brother, Jamal, was her pride and joy, a bright, driven young man who had earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. The scholarship covered tuition, but books, housing, and other expenses fell to Ava. She worked tirelessly to ensure that Jamal had every opportunity she hadn't. Her day typically started at 6 a.m. with a shift at a local bakery. She'd spend the morning selling coffee and pastries, then head home to check on Jamal, who lived with her in their tiny one-bedroom apartment. By 3 p.m., she'd start her evening shift at the diner, working until late into the night. It was grueling, but Ava rarely complained. She'd learned long ago that self-pity didn't pay the bills. On good days, Ava allowed herself to dream. As she poured coffee for the diner's regulars or cleaned up after messy families, she'd think about the small business she wanted to start, a catering company that combined her love of cooking with her knack for organizing. She pictured herself running a successful kitchen, hiring people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and giving them the kind of opportunities she'd never had. It was a beautiful dream, but one that felt increasingly out of reach. Money was always tight. Rent was due in a few days, and Ava was still short by $100. The car needed new tires, and Jamal's textbooks for the next semester were going to cost more than she'd saved. Every month was a juggling act, and every month she barely scraped by. Despite it all, Ava remained resilient. She prided herself on her ability to keep going, to put one foot in front of the other no matter how difficult the path. Her co-workers at the diner often marveled at her composure, wondering how she managed to stay so upbeat despite her circumstances. What they didn't see were the moments of doubt, the nights she cried quietly in the shower so Jamal wouldn't hear, the times she felt like giving up but couldn't because too many people depended on her. It wasn't just the financial strain that weighed on Ava. There was also the loneliness. Her life was so consumed by work and responsibility that she rarely had time for herself, let alone for dating. Men had come and gone, most unable to handle her busy schedule or her unwavering commitment to her family. She had stopped looking for love, telling herself that it was a distraction she couldn't afford. And yet, there were moments, like when she watched couples laughing together at the diner or saw families taking their children out for dinner, when she felt the ache of wanting more. One night, as Ava closed up the diner, she paused to look out the window. The streets were quiet, the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life. In this imagined future, she wasn't standing in a greasy uniform, her hands sore from hours of cleaning. Instead, she was dressed in professional attire, walking confidently into an office or a kitchen she owned. Her siblings were thriving, her business was booming, and she had someone by her side, a partner who truly understood her. The sound of a bell jolted her back to reality. A late-night customer had walked in, and Ava immediately returned to work, her dreams tucked away for another time. A few days later, Ava's world took an unexpected turn. A man walked into the diner, handsome, well-dressed, and exuding confidence. He was the kind of man who didn't usually step foot in places like this, which made his presence all the more striking. Ava noticed him immediately, though she tried not to stare. Customers like him often tipped well, but rarely stayed long. "Good morning," she said as she approached his table, keeping her tone professional. "What can I get you?" He smiled, his teeth white and perfect. "Just coffee for now. And maybe your name?" Ava raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Coffee it is," she replied, walking away. Something about him rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was his overly polished appearance, or the way he seemed too comfortable in a place, so clearly beneath his usual standards. Whatever it was, Ava didn't trust him. But over the next few days, he kept coming back. He always sat in her section, always found ways to engage her in conversation. His name, she learned, was Ethan Grant. Ethan was charming, there was no denying that. He asked about her day, complimented her work ethic, and seemed genuinely interested in her life. At first, Ava thought he was just another wealthy man looking for a thrill, but he persisted in a way that made her curious. He listened when she talked about Jamal and her dreams, asking questions that felt surprisingly thoughtful. "You're too good for this place," he said one evening as she refilled his coffee. "Have you ever thought about doing something else?" Ava hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "I have responsibilities." Ethan nodded, as if he understood. "But you've thought about it, haven't you? Starting your own business, or going back to school?" "Of course I've thought about it," Ava said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But thinking and doing are two very different things." Something in Ethan's expression shifted. For a moment, he looked almost sincere. "Maybe I can help," he said softly. Ava didn't know what to make of him. Part of her wanted to believe that he was genuine, that he really wanted to help her. But another part of her, the part that had been let down too many times before, told her to be cautious. She couldn't afford to get her hopes up. not when so much was at stake. As she watched Ethan leave the diner that night, Ava felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, curiosity, and a nagging sense of doubt. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Ethan returned to the diner the next morning, just as Ava had begun her shift. He timed his visits meticulously, ensuring that he'd catch her when the crowd was manageable enough for a conversation. Ava wasn't sure whether to be flattered or annoyed. She had grown accustomed to men trying to charm their way into her life, but something about Ethan was different. His persistence didn't come off as desperate or overbearing. It felt calculated, as though every move he made was part of a larger plan. The first few weeks of their interactions followed a predictable pattern. Ethan would order coffee, sometimes a light breakfast, and linger longer than most patrons. He asked questions that seemed harmless, about her favorite places in the city, her interests, and even her childhood. Ava, initially guarded, answered cautiously, unwilling to reveal too much. But Ethan had a way of steering conversations that disarmed her. His questions weren't intrusive. They felt sincere, as if he genuinely cared about her answers. "I don't get many chances to meet people like you," he said one evening, leaning forward slightly. "Most people in my world are shallow. They care more about what I have than who I am." Ava arched an eyebrow. "And what makes you think I'm different?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Because you haven't once asked me what I do for a living, or why I'm here in a place like this. Most people would have pried by now." Ava shrugged, her tone light but firm. "Maybe I don't care." For a brief moment, Ethan was caught off guard. He had expected her to be impressed, curious, or even intimidated by him. Instead, she was indifferent, and that intrigued him even more. Ava's response wasn't born out of rudeness. It came from a place of self-respect, a refusal to fawn over someone she barely knew. Still, Ava couldn't deny the allure of Ethan's charm. He was handsome, articulate, and attentive in a way that felt rare. Yet, something about his presence unsettled her. He was too polished, too perfect, and Ava had learned through hard experience that perfection often came with a price. Over the next few weeks, Ethan escalated his efforts. He began showing up unannounced during Ava's breaks, bringing her small tokens, flowers, chocolates, and once a hardcover book she had casually mentioned enjoying years ago. Each gesture was carefully calculated to earn her trust, and Ava, despite her reservations, started to soften. No one had ever shown her this kind of attention, let alone someone like Ethan. "You didn't have to do this," Ava said one day as Ethan handed her a small box containing a delicate bracelet. It wasn't gaudy or overly expensive, just simple enough to suit her style. "I'm not used to gifts like this." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice low and earnest. "But you deserve it. I just want to make you smile." Ava's lips curved into a reluctant smile, and Ethan felt a rush of satisfaction. He was winning, or at least he thought he was. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and Ava began spending more time together outside of the diner. He invited her to dinner at high-end restaurants, always choosing places that were just grand enough to impress her without overwhelming her. Ava was hesitant at first. Her schedule was packed, and she hated the idea of accepting too much from someone she barely knew. But Ethan's persistence wore her down, and eventually, she agreed to let him into her life, little by little. Their outings were a stark contrast to Ava's daily reality. Ethan took her to rooftop bars with panoramic views of the city, art galleries that left her speechless, and even a jazz club where the band played soulful melodies late into the night. Ava felt like she was living someone else's life during those moments, a life she had only glimpsed in movies or read about in books. But she never let herself forget where she came from. Ethan might have been able to whisk her away to fancy dinners, but at the end of the night, Ava always returned to her tiny apartment, where bills were stacked on the counter and Jamal's textbooks were spread across the kitchen table. It was a jarring contrast, one that kept her grounded even as Ethan tried to sweep her off her feet. For Ethan, the game was becoming more complex than he had anticipated. He had thought Ava would be an easy target, someone who would fall quickly for his charm and wealth. But Ava wasn't like the women he was used to. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't expect lavish gifts or grand gestures. In fact, she seemed almost embarrassed by his generosity, often insisting that he didn't need to go out of his way for her. "You're making me uncomfortable," she admitted one night as they sat on a park bench, sharing a cup of coffee. "I'm not used to this." "This?" Ethan asked, genuinely puzzled. "People doing things for me," she said. "I'm used to being the one who takes care of everyone else." Ethan was momentarily silent. He hadn't considered that his gestures, however well-intentioned they seemed, might make Ava feel uneasy. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of guilt, but he quickly brushed it aside, reminding himself that this was all part of the plan. The more time they spent together, the more Ethan began to see sides of Ava he hadn't anticipated. She was fiercely independent, intelligent, and deeply compassionate. She spoke passionately about her dreams of starting a business, her determination to support Jamal through college, and her desire to create a better life for herself and her family. Ethan found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. She challenged him, forced him to think about things he had long ignored: responsibility, kindness, and the emptiness of his own life. But Ethan refused to let himself fall. He couldn't. The bet loomed in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of why he had pursued Ava in the first place. This wasn't about love or connection. It was about proving a point. At least, that's what he told himself. Ava, for her part, was still cautious. While she appreciated Ethan's attention, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him didn't add up. He was too smooth, too calculated. She had tried asking him about his life, what he did for work, what brought him to her diner. But his answers were always vague. "I'm in business," he would say, brushing off the question with a charming smile. Nothing exciting. Despite her reservations, Ava found herself growing attached. Ethan made her feel seen in a way no one else had, and she couldn't deny the joy she felt when she was with him. But a small voice in the back of her mind warned her to be careful. She had been let down too many times before to ignore her instincts. One evening, as they walked along the river, Ethan turned to Ava with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Where?" Ava asked, curious but wary. "You'll see," he replied with a mysterious smile. He led her to a private rooftop overlooking the city, where a candlelit table was set up. Ava was stunned. "Ethan, this is too much," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Nothing's too much for you," Ethan said softly. "You deserve this." As they sat down to dinner, Ava couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, and a lingering sense of doubt. She wanted to believe that Ethan's feelings for her were genuine, but something about the whole evening felt too perfect, too rehearsed. Ethan, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting. He knew he was getting closer to the moment he had planned all along: the proposal. But as he looked across the table at Ava, her face illuminated by the city lights, he felt an unfamiliar pang of doubt. For the first time, he wondered if the bet was worth it. Ava wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was a real person with real emotions, and the thought of hurting her made him feel something he couldn't quite define. But Ethan was too proud to back down. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, no matter what. The wedding was everything Ethan Grant's friends had envisioned: lavish, grandiose, and dripping with excess. From the moment the invitations were sent out, it was clear that this was not going to be an ordinary ceremony. Held at a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the venue was designed to impress. Towering floral arrangements adorned every corner. Crystal chandeliers glimmered under the late afternoon sun, and a string quartet played softly in the background as guests arrived in their designer ensembles. For Ethan, this wedding was more than a spectacle. It was a performance. Every detail had been orchestrated to showcase his power and wealth while highlighting the absurdity of his choice in bride. Ava Brooks, the humble waitress from a diner, was now at the center of a world that had been constructed to mock her. And yet, she had no idea. Ava stood in a small room near the garden where the ceremony would take place, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized herself. Her dress, a stunning creation of white lace and silk, hugged her figure perfectly, the intricate beading catching the light. Her hair, styled by a professional for the first time in her life, fell in soft waves around her face, and her makeup was flawless. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel beautiful, even though a small part of her still couldn't believe this was real. "You look stunning," one of the makeup artists said, stepping back to admire her work. Ava managed to smile, though nerves twisted in her stomach. This entire day felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life. Despite Ethan's constant reassurances that she belonged here, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't. The guests outside, the socialites, the business tycoons, the celebrities, weren't her people. She had spent her entire life working for every small victory, and now she was surrounded by people who had likely never worked a day in theirs. Still, she reminded herself of why she had said yes. Ethan had been kind to her, attentive, and supportive in ways no one else had. He had promised her a better life, not just for her, but for Jamal, her brother, who was now fully enrolled in college thanks to Ethan's financial help. Ava told herself that this wasn't just a leap of faith for love. It was a chance to secure a future she had always dreamed of. But the doubt lingered. Why had a man like Ethan fallen for someone like her? It was a question she had asked herself countless times, and every time his answer was the same. Because you're different. You're real. Outside, the guests were settling into their seats, their chatter carrying across the perfectly manicured lawn. Ethan stood at the altar, looking every bit the part of a groom who had it all. His tuxedo, custom-made in Italy, was flawless, and his demeanor exuded confidence. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, he felt a flicker of unease. For weeks, he had been preparing for this moment, reassuring himself that it was just another game, another performance. But as he looked out at the crowd, his friends, his business associates, the people who had encouraged and cheered on this farce, he couldn't ignore the pang of guilt that gnawed at him. He had won the bet. Ava had fallen for him, agreed to marry him, and now stood poised to become part of his world. But at what cost? His friends, seated in the front row, exchanged knowing glances, their smirks barely concealed. To them, Ava was nothing more than a pawn in Ethan's elaborate game, a living, breathing punchline. The cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on Ethan, but he pushed the thought aside. He had committed to this, and there was no turning back now. When the ceremony began, all eyes turned to Ava as she stepped out of the garden room and walked down the aisle. A hush fell over the crowd as she appeared, radiant in her gown, her steps slow and deliberate. Despite her nerves, Ava held her head high, her expression one of quiet confidence. She may have felt out of place, but she refused to let it show. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach. She was stunning, far more than he had anticipated. For a brief moment, the bet, the performance, and the charade faded away, and all he could see was Ava, the woman who had challenged him, surprised him, and, against all odds, begun to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. The officiant began the ceremony, reciting the traditional vows as the guests looked on, some with admiration, others with thinly veiled amusement. Ava's sincerity shone through as she spoke her vows, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. Ethan, for his part, recited his lines with practiced ease, his words sounding heartfelt even though they were carefully rehearsed. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause. Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against Ava's in a kiss that felt strangely real, even to him. The moment was fleeting, but it left Ethan with an unsettling feeling, an ache he couldn't quite define. The reception that followed was as extravagant as the ceremony. Tables were adorned with gold-trimmed linens and towering centerpieces of roses and orchids. A live band played soft jazz as waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Guests mingled, their conversations a mix of idle gossip and speculation about Ethan's choice of bride. Ava, seated beside Ethan at the head table, did her best to navigate the whirlwind of introductions and conversations. She met his friends, his business partners, and his family, each interaction leaving her feeling more out of place. Many of the guests were polite, even friendly, but Ava couldn't shake the sense that she was being scrutinized, judged for every word she spoke and every gesture she made. "You're handling this well," Ethan said quietly, leaning over to her during a lull in the evening. "I'm trying," Ava replied, her smile tight. "But I feel like everyone's staring at me." "They are," Ethan admitted with a small smile. "But you're doing great. Just be yourself." His words, meant to reassure, only deepened Ava's unease. She wanted to believe that Ethan's feelings for her were genuine, that this wedding was more than a spectacle. But as she glanced around the room, catching the amused glances and whispered remarks of his friends, she couldn't ignore the nagging doubt in her mind. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself increasingly torn. Watching Ava navigate the room with grace and dignity, he felt an unexpected surge of pride. She was far stronger than he had given her credit for, and her authenticity only highlighted the shallowness of the world he had brought her into. For the first time, he questioned the morality of what he had done. By the time the first dance began, Ethan's resolve was starting to waver. As he led Ava onto the dance floor, he held her close, the music a soft backdrop to the thoughts racing through his mind. Ava looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment, Ethan felt completely exposed. She trusted him, believed in him, and he was about to shatter that trust. "You okay?" Ava asked softly, sensing his tension. Ethan forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just thinking about how lucky I am." Ava smiled, her doubt momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was real. But as the night drew to a close, the truth lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. Ethan had set out to win a bet, to manipulate a woman who deserved far better than the world he had dragged her into. And though he had succeeded in orchestrating the perfect wedding, he couldn't escape the growing realization that the cost of his victory might be more than he was willing to pay. The first weeks of marriage were a whirlwind of change for Ava. She moved into Ethan's expansive penthouse, a place so large and luxurious it felt more like a museum than a home. The glossy marble floors, towering glass windows, and impeccably curated decor made her feel like an intruder in someone else's life. It was a far cry from the cramped one-bedroom apartment she had shared with Jamal, where every surface had been covered with books, papers, and the remnants of their modest meals. At first, Ava was overwhelmed. Ethan had spared no expense in making her transition into his world seem effortless. He hired a personal stylist to revamp her wardrobe, arranged for a private driver to take her wherever she needed to go, and even cleared space in his calendar to spend time with her. To an outsider, it might have looked like the perfect marriage, but Ava knew better. She could sense an invisible wall between them, one that Ethan seemed determined to maintain no matter how hard she tried to break through. In the mornings, Ethan would leave early for work, often before Ava even woke up. The apartment felt eerily empty without him, and Ava found herself wandering through the rooms, trying to adjust to her new life. She was grateful for the opportunities this marriage had provided. Jamal's tuition was fully paid, and she no longer had to work grueling shifts at the diner. But the cost of those blessings weighed heavily on her. She missed the sense of purpose that had come with her old life, even as she struggled to reconcile it with her new reality. Ethan, for his part, was finding the adjustment equally challenging. He had always been used to living life on his terms, with no one to answer to but himself. Now he found himself coming home to a woman who challenged his carefully constructed facade in ways he hadn't anticipated. Ava's authenticity and grounded nature clashed with the shallow, self-centered world he had built for himself, and it made him uncomfortable. At first, Ethan tried to ignore the tension between them. He threw himself into work, attending meetings, sealing deals, and maintaining his reputation as a shrewd businessman. But no matter how busy he kept himself, he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that his life was missing something. He had won the bet, married Ava, and fulfilled his end of the bargain. But instead of satisfaction, he felt hollow. The first major crack in their marriage came during a dinner party Ethan hosted for his business associates. Ava had spent the entire day preparing, determined to make a good impression. She had chosen a simple but elegant dress, studied the guest list Ethan had given her, and practiced polite conversation topics in her head. But as soon as the guests arrived, she realized she was out of her depth. Ethan's friends were sharp-tongued and quick to judge, their conversations filled with jargon and inside jokes that Ava didn't understand. She tried her best to keep up, but it was clear to everyone in the room that she didn't belong. One of the women, a sleek socialite named Cassandra, took particular delight in making Ava feel small. "So, Ava," Cassandra said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Ethan tells me you used to work in a diner. That must have been humbling." Ava's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "It was hard work," she replied evenly. "But it taught me a lot about people and about myself." Cassandra raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "I'm sure it did, but you must admit this is quite a step up for you. How are you adjusting?" Before Ava could respond, Ethan intervened, his tone sharper than usual. "Ava's doing just fine," he said. "She's more capable than most people I know." The room fell silent, and Cassandra quickly changed the subject. But the damage was done. Ava spent the rest of the evening feeling like an outsider, painfully aware of the judgmental stares and whispered comments that followed her every move. Later that night, as they cleaned up after the party, Ava confronted Ethan. "Why didn't you tell me it would be like this?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "I felt like a joke out there." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not a joke, Ava. Those people, they don't matter. They matter to you." Ava shot back. "They're your friends, your colleagues. And they looked at me like I didn't belong." Ethan didn't have an answer. He knew she was right, but admitting it felt impossible. Instead, he muttered a weak apology and retreated to his office, leaving Ava alone in the kitchen. Despite the rocky start, Ava refused to give up. She threw herself into learning about Ethan's world, reading business magazines, watching documentaries, and even enrolling in an online class on entrepreneurship. She wanted to prove to herself and to Ethan that she could hold her own. Slowly, she began to find her footing, earning the respect of a few of Ethan's more open-minded friends. But the tension between her and Ethan persisted. He was distant, moody, and prone to disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. Ava tried to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that seemed to grow wider every day, but Ethan resisted. He was struggling with his own feelings, guilt, confusion, and a growing sense of admiration for Ava that he didn't know how to express. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Ava turned to Ethan and asked the question that had been weighing on her for weeks. "Why did you marry me?" Ethan froze, his mind racing for an answer. He couldn't tell her the truth, that it had started as a bet, a cruel joke designed to prove a point. But he also couldn't bring himself to lie. "Because I saw something in you," he said finally. "Something I don't see in anyone else." Ava studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I hope that's true," she said quietly. "Because I'm trying, Ethan. I really am. But sometimes it feels like you're not." Her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He wanted to tell her that she was right, that he had been selfish and cruel, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded and said, "I'll try harder. I promise." Over time, Ethan began to change. He started spending more time at home, asking Ava about her day and listening, really listening, to her answers. He supported her as she worked on her business plan, offering advice, and even connecting her with some of his contacts. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. Ava noticed the change, but she remained cautious. She wanted to believe that Ethan's efforts were genuine, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. She told herself to be patient, to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, relationships were about compromise, and she wasn't perfect either. The turning point came when Ava decided to host a dinner party of her own, inviting a mix of her old friends and some of Ethan's business associates. It was a bold move, one that required a delicate balancing act, but Ava was determined to prove that she could bring their two worlds together. The evening started off awkwardly, with Ethan's colleagues looking visibly uncomfortable in the casual, homey setting Ava had created. But as the night went on, something surprising happened. Ava's warmth and authenticity began to break down the barriers between the two groups. By the time dessert was served, the room was filled with laughter and lively conversation. Ethan watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and pride. For the first time, he saw Ava not as someone trying to fit into his world, but as someone creating a world of her own. one that he wanted to be a part of. That night, as they cleaned up together, Ethan finally opened up. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Ava looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. He knew that telling her the truth would risk everything, but he also knew that keeping it hidden would destroy them. "I wasn't honest with you in the beginning," he admitted. "About why I pursued you. About why I married you." Ava's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she waited for him to continue. "It started as a bet," Ethan said quietly. "A stupid, cruel bet. I didn't think it would go this far. But somewhere along the way, everything changed. You changed me." The room fell silent as Ava processed his words. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she stood up and walked away, leaving Ethan alone in the kitchen, unsure if he had just saved their marriage or destroyed it. The days following Ethan's confession were heavy with silence. Ava avoided him as much as possible, retreating to her room or leaving the penthouse early in the morning to wander the city. Ethan, for the first time in his life, felt powerless. He had built an empire by controlling every aspect of his life. But now, the one thing he wanted, Ava's forgiveness, was completely out of his hands. Ava spent her days thinking about everything Ethan had said. A bet. Their entire relationship had started as a cruel joke, a way for him to entertain his friends and prove his superiority. She replayed every moment of their courtship in her mind, searching for clues she had missed. How had she been so blind? How had she let herself believe that someone like Ethan could love someone like her? And yet, she couldn't ignore the changes she had seen in him. He had been distant at first, but over time, he had started to show vulnerability to let her in. Was it possible that his feelings for her had become real? Or was that just another part of his manipulation? On the third day, Ava decided she needed answers. She found Ethan in his office, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, his eyes filled with guilt and exhaustion. "I need you to tell me everything," Ava said, her voice steady but firm. "No more half-truths. I deserve to know." Ethan nodded, his expression solemn. He told her everything: the bet, the pressure from his friends, the initial thrill of winning her over. He didn't try to sugarcoat it, knowing that she would see through any attempts to downplay his actions. But he also told her about how his feelings had changed, how her strength and kindness had forced him to confront the emptiness of his own life. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "But I swear, Ava, it stopped being about the bet a long time ago. You've changed me in ways I never thought possible. And I love you." Ava stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You love me?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "After everything you've done, you think those words mean anything to me?" Ethan flinched but didn't look away. "I know they don't," he admitted. "Not yet, but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving to you that they're true." Ava didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan alone with his regret. That evening, Ava sat alone in the living room, staring out at the city lights. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite define. She thought about everything Ethan had done for her, the ways he had supported her dreams and helped her build a new life. Was that all just a facade? Or had there been moments of genuine connection amidst the lies? As she sat there, memories of her own past began to surface, memories she had worked hard to bury. She thought about her childhood, her family, and the choices that had led her to this point. Ethan wasn't the only one with secrets. The next morning, Ava made a decision. If their marriage had any chance of surviving, Ethan needed to know the truth about her. She found him in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring blankly out the window. He looked up when she entered, his expression wary. "We need to talk," Ava said, her tone serious. Ethan nodded, setting down his mug. "I'm listening." Ava took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You're not the only one who hasn't been honest," she began. "There are things about my past that I've never told you. Things I've kept hidden because I didn't think they mattered. But now, I think you deserve to know." Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowing in concern. "What are you talking about?" Ava hesitated, then began to speak. She told him about her family, how they had once been wealthy and influential before losing everything. Her father had been a successful entrepreneur, but a series of bad investments and betrayals had left them bankrupt. Ava's mother had struggled to hold the family together, but the stress eventually took its toll, leading to her early death. "I was just a teenager when it happened," Ava said, her voice trembling. "One day, we had everything. The next, we were living out of a car, trying to figure out how to survive. I had to grow up fast, take care of my siblings, find ways to make money, keep us all from falling apart." Ethan listened intently, his expression filled with a mixture of empathy and shock. He had never imagined that Ava's life had been so turbulent, so filled with loss and hardship. But it wasn't just her story that struck him. It was the realization that her past and his own actions were connected. "There's more," Ava continued, her voice growing softer. "One of the companies my father invested in, the one that ultimately led to our downfall, was yours." Ethan froze, his mind racing. He had built his empire on aggressive business tactics, often taking advantage of struggling companies to further his own success. He had never considered the human cost of those decisions, but now, sitting in front of Ava, the consequences were impossible to ignore. "My father believed in your company," Ava said, her eyes locking onto his. "He thought it was his chance to turn things around. But when it collapsed, it took everything we had with it." Ethan's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. He had been so focused on winning, on proving his superiority, that he had never stopped to think about the lives he was destroying along the way. And now, the woman he had come to care for, the woman he claimed to love, was one of those casualties. "Ava," Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. I believe you," Ava said, her tone laced with pain. "But that doesn't change what happened. My family paid the price for your ambition. And now, I don't know if I can forgive you for that." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. All he could do now was try to make amends, to prove to her that he was capable of change. Over the next few weeks, their marriage hung in the balance. Ethan began taking steps to repair the damage he had done, not just to Ava, but to others he had hurt in the pursuit of wealth. He reached out to the families of those affected by his business dealings, offering financial restitution and heartfelt apologies. It was a small start, but it was genuine. Ava, meanwhile, focused on her own healing. She threw herself into her business, determined to build something that honored her family's legacy. She wasn't ready to forgive Ethan, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. Slowly, the wall between them began to crack. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ava turned to Ethan. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. "Because I want to be better," Ethan replied. "For you, for myself, for all the people I've hurt. I can't change the past, but I can try to make things right." Ava studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "Maybe there's hope for us after all," she said quietly. Ethan's heart swelled with relief, but he knew their journey was far from over. There were still wounds to heal, truths to confront, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. And so did Ava. The weeks following Ava's revelation marked a profound shift in Ethan's life. The world he had carefully constructed, with its veneer of invincibility and wealth, had been exposed for what it truly was: hollow. Ava's story had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the damage his ambition had caused, not just to her family, but to countless others. Her words echoed in his mind. "My family paid the price for your ambition." For the first time in his life, Ethan began to reevaluate everything he had once valued. He no longer felt pride in his sprawling empire, his luxurious penthouse, or the power he wielded in boardrooms. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility, the responsibility to right the wrongs he had inflicted on others, and the responsibility to rebuild trust with Ava. Ethan's transformation began quietly. He started with the people closest to him, the employees who had worked tirelessly in his companies, often overlooked and undervalued. He held meetings with his management teams, urging them to prioritize fairness and equity in their practices. He implemented new policies to ensure better wages and benefits for his staff, even if it meant sacrificing some of his own profits. But it wasn't just about his business practices. Ethan also reached out to the families of those whose lives had been impacted by his aggressive takeovers. He tracked down the investors who had lost everything, including Ava's father's business associates. He set up a fund to provide financial restitution and offered to support their recovery efforts. While many were skeptical of his intentions, others accepted his apologies with cautious gratitude. For Ethan, each step was both a challenge and a revelation. He began to see the ripple effects of his actions, how one decision could devastate lives in ways he had never imagined. The experience humbled him, stripping away the arrogance that had once defined him. Ava watched Ethan's efforts from a distance, her feelings a mix of skepticism and reluctant admiration. She had always believed that people were capable of change, but Ethan's transformation felt almost too good to be true. Could someone who had built their entire identity on selfish ambition truly become selfless? Or was this just another performance, another way for him to control the narrative? One evening, as she worked on her business plan in the living room, Ethan approached her hesitantly. He held a stack of papers in his hand, his expression uncertain. "I wanted to show you this," he said, placing the papers on the table in front of her. Ava looked at him warily before picking up the stack. As she flipped through the pages, she realized it was a proposal, a plan to use his wealth and influence to create a foundation that supported small businesses and entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. "It's just an idea," Ethan said quickly, as if afraid she might dismiss it outright. "But I want to do something meaningful with what I've built, something that actually helps people instead of hurting them." Ava's eyes lingered on the proposal, her heart conflicted. She could see the sincerity in Ethan's efforts, but she wasn't ready to let go of the pain he had caused her family. "This is a good start," she said finally. "But it's going to take more than this to make things right." Ethan nodded, his expression somber. "I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's dedication to change became impossible to ignore. He sold off several of his more controversial business ventures, using the proceeds to fund community programs and charitable initiatives. He started volunteering at local shelters and mentoring young entrepreneurs, actions that felt foreign at first but gradually became a source of fulfillment. For Ethan, these acts of service were more than just gestures. They were a way to reconnect with humanity, to remind himself of the people behind the numbers and profits. He found himself humbled by the resilience of those he met, their stories of struggle and triumph mirroring Ava's in ways that left him both inspired and ashamed. Ava, meanwhile, began to notice the subtle but significant changes in Ethan's demeanor. He was no longer the self-assured, arrogant man she had first met. Instead, he seemed quieter, more introspective, and genuinely invested in the well-being of others. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions instead of giving orders, and approached life with a humility that had once seemed impossible. Despite her lingering doubts, Ava couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. She saw glimpses of the man Ethan could become, the man he was trying to become, and it stirred something within her. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but she was willing to give him a chance to prove himself. One evening, Ethan surprised Ava by inviting her to an event at a local community center. It was a celebration for the entrepreneurs he had been mentoring, many of whom had received funding from his new foundation. The room was filled with laughter and energy, a stark contrast to the sterile, elitist gatherings of his past. As Ethan introduced Ava to the attendees, she felt an unexpected sense of pride. These were people who had been given a second chance because of Ethan's efforts, people who reminded her of herself and her own struggles. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as the man who had hurt her family, but as someone capable of making a real difference. Later that night, as they walked home, Ava turned to Ethan. "You've changed," she said quietly. "I don't know how or why, but you're not the same man you were when I met you." Ethan looked at her, his expression earnest. "You're the reason I changed, Ava. You showed me what it means to be strong, to care about something bigger than myself. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to earn it." Ava was silent for a moment, her emotions warring within her. Finally, she said, "It's not about deserving, Ethan. It's about trust, and trust takes time." From that point on, their relationship began to heal. It wasn't an easy process. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings, and lingering pain. But there were also moments of connection, of shared laughter, and quiet conversations that reminded them of what had drawn them together in the first place. Ethan continued to prove himself, not with grand gestures, but with consistent actions. He supported Ava as she launched her own catering business, using his connections to help her secure clients while letting her take the lead. He became more involved in Jamal's life, attending his college events and offering guidance without overstepping. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt the trust he had broken. By the end of the year, Ethan and Ava's marriage had transformed into something neither of them had expected. What had started as a cruel bet had become a journey of redemption and growth, a testament to the power of change and the resilience of the human spirit. As they sat together one evening, watching the sunset from the rooftop of their home, Ethan took Ava's hand in his. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me a chance to be better." Ava looked at him, her heart full of both gratitude and hope. "Thank you for proving that people can change," she replied, "even when it seems impossible." And for the first time in a long time, they both felt at peace. The following spring, Ava stood in the bustling kitchen of her newly opened catering business, surrounded by the hum of activity. A team of chefs and servers worked tirelessly to prepare for their biggest event yet, a gala for the foundation Ethan had started to support underprivileged entrepreneurs. The smell of fresh herbs and simmering sauces filled the air as Ava oversaw every detail, her clipboard in hand and her heart swelling with pride. This moment had been years in the making. From the humble beginnings of her dream to the tumultuous journey with Ethan, everything had led to this. It wasn't just her business. It was a symbol of resilience, growth, and the life she had fought to rebuild. The gala that evening was a striking contrast to the events that had once defined Ethan's life. Held in a renovated community center instead of a sprawling mansion, the venue reflected the values he and Ava now shared. The walls were adorned with photographs of small business owners whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's grants and mentorship programs. Tables were set with simple yet elegant decorations, and the attendees were a mix of entrepreneurs, community leaders, and families. Ethan stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Gone was the cocky, self-assured man who had once thrived on spectacle and excess. In his place was someone quieter, more grounded, and deeply committed to making a difference. He had learned to find fulfillment not in flaunting his wealth, but in using it to create opportunities for others. When Ava arrived, carrying a tray of appetizers to the reception area, their eyes met across the room. Ethan's heart swelled as he watched her move through the crowd with confidence and poise, her natural warmth drawing people in. She was no longer the uncertain woman he had first met in a diner. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he couldn't have been prouder. "You're incredible," Ethan said when she finally reached him, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Ava smiled, her eyes soft. "I couldn't have done this without you." Ethan shook his head. "No, this was all you. I'll just help clear the path." Their conversation was interrupted as the evening's program began. Guests took their seats, and Ethan stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room to deliver his opening remarks. He glanced at Ava as he spoke, drawing strength from her presence. "Tonight is about more than just celebrating success," Ethan began, his voice steady. "It's about acknowledging the resilience and determination of people who refuse to give up, even when the odds are stacked against them. I've had the privilege of working with so many incredible individuals through this foundation, and each of them has taught me something invaluable. That true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you give." The room erupted into applause, and Ethan stepped down, his speech leaving a lasting impression on the audience. As he returned to his seat beside Ava, she reached over and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the bond they had rebuilt. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Ava and Ethan slipped away to the balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air wrapped around them as they leaned against the railing, their gazes fixed on the skyline. "This feels surreal," Ava said after a long silence. "A year ago, I never could have imagined we'd be here." Ethan nodded, his expression contemplative. Neither could I. Sometimes, I still can't believe you gave me another chance. Ava turned to him, her eyes searching his. You earned it, Ethan. It wasn't easy, and there were times I wasn't sure if we'd make it. But you proved to me that people can change. And that means everything. Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. You're the reason I changed, Ava. You made me want to be better, not just for you, but for myself. I don't think I can ever fully make up for what I did, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying. Ava smiled, her expression softening. We both made mistakes, but we also chose to move forward. That's what matters. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their journey settling over them like a warm blanket. It hadn't been easy. There had been tears, arguments, and moments of doubt, but they had emerged stronger, both as individuals and as a couple. In the months that followed, Ava and Ethan continued to grow together. Their lives were no longer defined by power struggles or insecurities, but by mutual respect and shared purpose. Ava's catering business flourished, quickly gaining a reputation for its innovative menu and commitment to hiring staff from disadvantaged backgrounds. She worked tirelessly to ensure that her success uplifted others, drawing inspiration from her own journey. Ethan, meanwhile, expanded the foundation, partnering with other organizations to reach more communities. He found fulfillment in mentoring young entrepreneurs and using his influence to create systemic change. For the first time, he felt like his wealth had a purpose beyond self-indulgence. Their personal lives also blossomed. They made time for each other, carving out moments of joy amidst their busy schedules. They traveled together, exploring new places and creating memories that reminded them of how far they had come. They also spent more time with Jamal, who had graduated college and was pursuing a career in engineering. Watching him thrive filled Ava with a sense of pride and validation that all her sacrifices had been worth it. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on the patio of their home, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Ava's eyes widened as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold bracelet engraved with the words, "Strength and Love." I know it's not much, Ethan said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. But I wanted you to have something that represents what you mean to me. You've been my strength through everything, and you've shown me what love really is. Ava blinked back tears as she took the bracelet and fastened it around her wrist. It's perfect, she whispered, leaning over to kiss him. Thank you. Ethan smiled, his heart full. In that moment, he realized that he didn't need grand gestures or extravagant displays to prove his love. What mattered was the life they were building together, a life rooted in honesty, compassion, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. As the years passed, Ethan and Ava's story became an inspiration to others. Their journey from manipulation and betrayal to love and redemption proved that people could change, that mistakes could be forgiven, and that broken relationships could be rebuilt with patience and effort. They weren't perfect. No one was, but they had learned to face their flaws together, to support each other in their weaknesses and celebrate each other's strengths. And in doing so, they had created a life that was richer and more meaningful than anything they could have imagined. On their anniversary, as they stood together on the same balcony where they had once reflected on their journey, Ava looked up at Ethan and smiled. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan nodded, pulling her into his arms. "And we're just getting started." Together, they gazed out at the city, the lights twinkling like stars, a testament to the resilience of love and the transformative power of growth. Their story wasn't just about redemption. It was about choosing each other again and again, no matter the challenges. And that choice made all the difference.